Good evening and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you once again to the Krasno Global Event Series. It's a great pleasure to see you again, and I'm glad we again have a large national and indeed global audience tonight. I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. The Krasno Global Event Series features leading experts from the world of diplomacy, the military, journalism, the media, the economy, public policy, and many other areas. And we always talk about issues of global concern. Normally, of course, we have live events, but today we once again have a Zoom session as unfortunately the coronavirus crisis is of course still continuing. As you know, we have a wonderful website that is krasnoevents.com. And here you can find a form to fill in if you wish to be on our mailing list. You can also just send me an email and I will put you on our famous mailing list. And of course, it's worth your while to be on our mailing list because you will get information about our future events. We also have a popular YouTube channel that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We videotape all our events and upload them to our YouTube channel. For example, the talk by Admiral Dennis Blair some 2 weeks ago is now already up and you can watch it if you like. Please be so kind and subscribe to our channel because we need your support, and it is of course worth your while to watch our videos as often as you possibly can. They're all really brilliant. And our talks and discussion today also promises to be highly exciting. We are dealing with a very topical but also very sad issue. And that is, of course, the coronavirus, which has been devastating the world and not least the United States, but also many other countries, such as the UK, Spain, Italy, France, India, Brazil, and many more, unfortunately. Scientists everywhere are desperately trying to develop a vaccine. And today we will hear from 4 leading public health experts if we can expect a vaccine soon. And indeed, Russia and China say they have already developed a vaccine. How good and how safe is it? These and many other questions we will discuss today. We have 4 speakers today. There's Tom Bolky of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He has just published a very well-received article on vaccine nationalism in Foreign Affairs magazine. Then we have Richard Hatchett, who worked as a public health expert in both the Bush and Obama administrations, and he is now CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. He joins us from London today. Then we have Deborah Seligsohn, who is now a professor at Villanova University near Philadelphia. She's a China expert and used to work in the State Department and for the World Resources Institute. And last, and certainly not least, there is Salli, who is a vaccine expert and a professor of genetics, pediatrics, immunology at Duke University, just down the road from here. I would also like to mention our 2 great Krasno assistants, that is Anna Fiore and Laurel Fright. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our panel tonight on the global race for a vaccine. Each speaker will talk for some 10 minutes to give us an overview of the current situation from a different aspect. I will then pose a few questions to each of our speakers and interrogate them a little. And then, as always, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. We would like you to submit your many questions by means of our Q&A function at the Zoom screen at the bottom of your screen. Our 2 formidable Krasno assistants, Anna and Laurel, will select the questions and read them out aloud. Thus, please don't be shy. Please submit your questions. Can I also ask you to mention your name and perhaps your affiliation when writing down a question? And please ask short and succinct questions. This would be wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome our panel tonight on the coronavirus and the global race for a vaccine. Let's begin with Dr. Tom Bolky. Tom is director of the Global Health Program and a senior fellow for global health, economics, and development at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He's also a law professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In his introductory remarks, Tom Bolky will talk about the tragedy of vaccine nationalism. Over to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you so much, Klaus, for that very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, as well as with this audience. I'm sorry that we can't all be in person. The one part of the global response to this pandemic that has gone well has been the science. Within 4 days of the publication of the genetic sequence of the coronavirus by China, potential vaccine candidates had already been identified and development had begun. 66 days after the publication of that genetic sequence, the first clinical trial of a corona vaccine began. Today, according to the World Health Organization's latest landscape, there are 187 vaccine candidates in development. 38 of those are in clinical development. 9 are in the latest stage of clinical development. As Klaus mentioned earlier, China and Russia have already authorized their leading candidates for emergency use. I believe it was last week, the days start to blend together in the midst of this pandemic, but just last week, the United Arab Emirates had granted also emergency use authorization of China's vaccines. There's obviously been much discussion in the United States about whether or not a vaccine candidate will be authorized for emergency use prior to the election. Who knows whether that will occur as of yet, but the fact that it's even a topic of conversation is astonishing. The previous record for the development of a novel vaccine was 4 years. So once we move towards authorization, either on an emergency basis or eventually approval, who's going to receive this vaccine? What happens next? Most countries will not be able to manufacture this vaccine. Vaccine manufacturing is fundamentally different, more complex, more expensive than small molecule drug manufacturing. Many of you may be more familiar with. In particular, the capacity to manufacture the antigen, the active ingredient of vaccines, is quite limited. There are efforts underway that Richard might talk about in his remarks to ramp up that capacity, but it is not going to be sufficient, at least initially, to meet global demand for this vaccine. This vaccine by many world leaders has been referred to as a global public good, but it is not. It is, for those of you with an economics training, it is both excludable, meaning one country can keep supplies from other nations, and rivalrous, which is use by one country's population will come at the expense of the use of another country's population. What should happen with these limited early supplies of a proven coronavirus vaccine? It is in the interest of every nation that it be shared and allocated according to public health need. That's not just a moral requirement, although it is. It is a matter of a nation's self-interest in their own health. It is in every nation's interest to share because it is the fastest way to get this pandemic under control. Early vaccines are likely to only be partially protective. If the virus is spreading unabatedly in other nations, it puts your own citizens, even if they've been vaccinated, at risk. There are the economic consequences. Even countries that have successfully suppressed transmission of this virus, countries like South Korea, or in terms of its later efforts, Germany, have still suffered grievously economically from this pandemic due to its effects that it's having in other nations as well. So we have that interest. From a geopolitical perspective, we have an interest in the future of cooperation. And if we cannot share a medical intervention in which it is everyone's interest to share in the midst of a pandemic, what is it that we will be able to cooperate on globally in terms of addressing potential future pandemics, or whether it be any other collective action problems like climate change or reducing nuclear proliferation. So that's what should happen. The recent history, though, isn't encouraging as to whether that will happen. In the past, when you've had a medical urgent international health crisis and there have been limited medical supplies to address that crisis, wealthy nations have hoarded. Some of you may remember in the 2009 pandemic of H1N1 influenza, wealthy nations bought up virtually all the supplies of those vaccines. WHO, the World Health Organization, appealed, and eventually the United States, Canada, and 7 other nations donated 10% of their vaccine stocks to low and middle income countries. However, this came only after it was clear the virus was not nearly as deadly as people initially feared, and after there was indications that there were more than enough for those nations to address their domestic demands. In the early stages of this pandemic, 70 countries plus the European Union imposed export bans and in some instances seized local supplies of personal protective equipment like masks, ventilators, and other essential medical supplies. Those countries include almost all, or most at least, of the countries where a potential coronavirus vaccine will be manufactured. Remdesivir, the first effective treatment identified for this virus, the United States bought up 3 months of the global supply of that before it could be shared. The good news is there is a collaborative initiative underway led by the World Health Organization, Gavi, and my colleague Richard Hatchett's organization, Sept, to have an equitable distribution of vaccines globally, to have them be available everywhere at the same time. This past week, there was a deadline last Friday, I guess officially, for countries to sign up formally to express interest. In addition to the low and middle income countries that are eligible for assistance for their vaccines, 64 higher income self-financing countries also submitted formal statements of interest. That includes 35 countries individually, plus the European Commission and its member states. United States and China and Russia are not participating in that collaborative initiative, but we're not expected to. So that is not news. That said, there are some worrisome signs suggesting that we may still be heading down the path towards vaccine nationalism. The first is that many of the countries, more than half of the countries that have signed up for CEPI, so this includes the European Commission, plus Japan, Canada, Australia, and others, have also entered into deals with pharmaceutical companies, advanced purchase agreements to buy supplies of potential vaccines. These deals are worrisome really for 2 reasons. The first is that they consume resources. Countries are competing over entering into these deals and the prices are getting higher in terms of purchasing these advanced doses. Those are resources that could be otherwise devoted to COVAX and to the ACT accelerator of which COVAX is a part. And right now they are short of the financing threshold that they're seeking to achieve their goals. The second concern is, as we talked about at the outset, vaccine manufacturing capacity is scarce, and these deals are reserving vaccine manufacturing capacity. So that is a concern as well. The third worrisome sign is there has been no agreement reached among nations to refrain from imposing export bans and expropriating or seizing local supplies of either vaccine inputs or vaccines. So it may be that countries that are manufacturing either seize those supplies, or countries with inputs seek to leverage them in order to get them. So what we lay out in my paper that Klaus was kind enough to mention in Foreign Affairs with Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute is that the situation that we're looking at is effectively your classic prisoner's dilemma, with every country very much acting like the proverbial prisoner. If countries vis-a-vis vaccine allocation perceive that every other nation is likely to act as a nationalist and in its own self-interest, they will act like a nationalist too. So what does one do to shift a non-cooperative environment to a cooperative environment? How do you do that in game theory? You do that through reciprocity. And what we suggest in the paper is that COVAX is a noble initiative and deserves all the support it can get, but it will need it. And one way to achieve that is to leverage the potential forms of reciprocity that exist by reaching a trade and investment agreement in which countries refrain to impose export bans and seize local supplies of vaccine inputs or vaccine doses, and have that apply to COVID therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics. So a short-term agreement, not applying more long-term, although perhaps setting up a framework with that. When you do that, countries have an incentive to uphold those commitments, because without being in that agreement, those export restrictions may be imposed against them. In sum, what I'll say is time is running out. We could be weeks away or months away from the first proven vaccine emerging, and it is incumbent on us to do all that we can to ensure that there is a global arrangement up for to enable an equitable public health driven system for allocating them. And with that, I will stop, and I look forward to the comments of my colleagues and the discussion.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was very illuminating. But you mentioned also Russia and China and the UAE. So how effective is their vaccine? There must be a vaccine which they have tried on their own military, on some frontline workers. And is the US or other Western countries trying to get hold of that vaccine as well?
Not as of yet in terms of Western countries. The vaccine on the Russia side, and I would distinguish between the two circumstances. Russia did a clinical trial involving 79 subjects and has indicated that would effectively account for phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials to determine the safety of the vaccine and its dosage. They have then done a emergency use authorization. They are now doing a larger phase 3 clinical trial to convince other nations that they should want this vaccine. On the Chinese side, in the early stages of development, China actually, which has not historically developed novel vaccines, or at least not novel vaccines that other nations have been willing to use, had published their results, had subjected them to peer review. As they've progressed, they have authorized the use of the vaccine, some of their vaccines, for members of state-owned enterprises and the military. Those are, as I understand it, meant to be outside of the clinical trial process, although have, again, as I understand it, and perhaps Professor Seligsohn knows more, have been used to point to the safety of the vaccine, which is worrisome in that case because, of course, they're not be giving out in a controlled setting. So I think where you may see other countries, including in the West, being more interested in China and Russia's vaccines is if they can't get access to the leading proven vaccines that are emerging from more traditional vaccine players. And that may be one consequence of vaccine nationalism. I'm fine with that, provided that Russia and China can substantiate that they're safe and effective, and that the clinical trials are conducted according to international requirements and ethical requirements. The fear is that they may not meet those standards, and countries may take them anyways because they have no other alternative.
Right, thank you very much. We'll discuss that further, I'm sure. Let's come to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Hatchett. He joins us from London, where it's already quite late, I think. Richard is the CEO for the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, Sept. Formerly, he served on the Homeland Security Council under President George W. Bush and on the National Security Council under President Obama. Richard's introductory remarks are entitled Sept, COVAX, and Vaccine Multilateralism. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Laris and Anna and Laurel and the Krasno Global Events Series and University of North Carolina. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. For me, it is after 9 o'clock here, but delighted to participate. I shared with Professor Laris as we were preparing. I used to live in Chapel Hill, so I'm sorry that I couldn't come back in person, but delighted to participate. It's also a pleasure to follow Tom in his remarks, and I want to add my commendation about his article, which is in the September and October Foreign Affairs. It really is the best analysis that I have seen in the last 9 months of this problem of vaccine nationalism. He's given a very nice overview of it, but the article is really splendid and definitely worth looking at. He talked about in his brief remarks the idea that the problem that we face right now resembles the game theory problem of the prisoner's dilemma, and I would have to concur. This is really the best real-world example of the prisoner's dilemma that I have ever encountered. Essentially what you have is that countries left to their own devices and acting in more or less rational ways are going to produce suboptimal outcomes, extremely suboptimal outcomes that result in the perpetuation of the pandemic, greater loss of life, and greater economic damage. And this is beginning, some groups have begun to model this out, and it's very clear that a cooperative approach would result in much better outcomes in all three dimensions. I want to start by talking a little bit about CEPI and why we were created, and then I'll talk about what we've been doing with respect to COVID and in terms of vaccine development and our efforts with respect to COVAX to promote, in contrast to vaccine nationalism, something that Prime Minister Lee of Singapore has referred to, I think appropriately, as vaccine multilateralism. First, just to say that the experience that we're having now with COVID-19, one of the most overused words of the last 9 months is that what we are experiencing is unprecedented. And I would agree that in many respects it is unprecedented. It is certainly the worst infectious disease crisis of the last century, but it was not unanticipated. Many people working in public health had recognized the threat of epidemics and pandemic diseases, that they are a constitutive part of modern life. They are an existential threat to our way of life and to our livelihoods. And I would argue that they are essentially an emergent property of how we have organized our social world. They reflect the growth of populations, the concentration of populations in megacities, incursions into previously remote areas, the effects of climate change, increased trade and transportation. And so we have created a world that provides microbes with tremendous opportunities to break out. And many of us had said for years that it was not a matter of if, but when, and when is now. The problem with epidemic and pandemic threats is that they are fundamentally transnational threats. They do not, epidemic diseases do not respect political borders, and they need to be addressed collectively if they are to be addressed effectively. CEPI, as an organization, was created after one of the most recent infectious disease crises, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014 and 2015. In that epidemic, as many of you will remember, the three countries of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone were affected by an epidemic lasting almost 18 months. Some 28,000 people were infected and over 11,000 people died. Late in the epidemic, after the epidemic had been brought under control, or was being brought under control, I should say, with traditional public health interventions, a vaccine, an experimental vaccine was deployed and tested in the field in the midst of the Ebola epidemic and shown to be essentially 100% effective in preventing Ebola in exposed persons. That vaccine had been under development for more than a decade, but had never been tested in clinical trials. And global public health leaders realized the profound tragedy that we had a vaccine, but because it had not received substantial funding and had not been accelerated in its development, it was not ready in time to stop and prevent the major impacts of that epidemic. And as a result, over a period of about a year of reflection and conferences and after action reports, a collective decision was made to create an organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, to essentially to develop vaccines against known epidemic threats like Ebola, and we have worked on many other diseases, as well as to develop capabilities to respond rapidly to emerging epidemic threats such as COVID-19. In terms of, we were formally established in the beginning of 2017, so we are a very new organization, but we have moved very rapidly to prepare ourselves to respond to emerging threats. As it happens, CEPI, one of the diseases that CEPI had focused on was the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, which is a related coronavirus. And so we had already invested around $130 or $140 million in developing coronavirus vaccines and had developed rapid response platforms. And so when COVID-19 emerged, we moved very, very rapidly to establish COVID-19 vaccine development efforts. And in fact, we put our first contracts in place 12 days after the viral sequences were released, so on January 23rd. One of those contracts that we put in place on January 23rd was a contract with the company Moderna that Tom mentioned in his remarks, and we helped them manufacture their candidate vaccine, which only 66 days after the viral sequences were released, entered clinical trials and is now in phase 3 clinical trials. So we invested early. We set as our priorities to invest in vaccines that could meet our criteria of speed in terms of development, scale in terms of being able to produce ultimately hundreds of millions or even billions of doses, and that would promote our goal of promoting equitable access. Subsequently, we became one of the early advocates for ensuring that vaccines were distributed through a globally fair allocation system. And we have worked very diligently with our international partners, with the WHO, with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, with the World Bank, and with many other non-governmental partners to establish both the access to COVID-19 tools, or ACT is the acronym, the ACT Accelerator, and underneath that ACT Accelerator, COVAX, which is the Global COVID-19 Vaccines Access Facility. And COVAX is a joint effort between CEPI, WHO, and Gavi. The idea with COVAX is to share risk, to invite countries to make investments to share risk in a large portfolio of vaccines, because we don't know which vaccines are going to succeed. We want a highly diversified portfolio so that we can increase our probability of success, and to share the benefits of pooled procurement. By pooling together and making joint procurements, they create market guarantees that are very attractive to companies in terms of providing a guarantee for vaccine output. And then that vaccine that is purchased could then be shared in a globally fair and equitable way. Tom mentioned that on Monday, we announced the initial round of countries that had joined. The 156 countries that joined do cut across all income categories, from low income to high income categories, and they represent collectively some 2/3 of the global population. This is actually an extraordinary achievement, and as COVAX moves forward, it promises to do something that is actually unprecedented, to use that overused term again, in the history of global public health. I'm going to share my screen, if I might, just to, I guess I can't. I had one slide I was hoping to show. But I can describe it just as well. It's a slide that shows the death rate from HIV in the United States, which plummeted starting in 1996 and 1997 after highly active antiretroviral therapy became available to treat HIV and AIDS patients. And it shows the death rate in Africa, which continued to climb for over a decade until highly active antiretroviral therapy became broadly available because of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. And so there was a decade when life-saving interventions were not available in Africa because no one was funding it, no one was providing it. COVAX, we hope, will, for the first time, deliver life-saving medical interventions to people all around the world at the same time. I think my time is running short, so let me stop there, but happy during the question and answer period to talk about where we're going next, when we anticipate vaccines arriving, and what the prospects are for epidemic and pandemic preparedness in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was most illuminating. That is certainly what we want to know about, what you just raised. But initially, you talked at length about COVAX, which I think was new to many people. And also it is puzzling, why would the United States and China not be part of that initiative?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways that high-income countries can participate. And what the United States has done, and I think many people in the audience will certainly be aware of Operation Warp Speed and the tremendous investments that the US government has made in supporting the development of vaccines. They have invested at present some $10 to $12 billion in the development. And the US has essentially made a judgment that they have a portfolio of vaccines that is large enough and diversified enough that they are confident that they will be able to meet the needs of the US population through the vaccines that they have already funded. And that they do not need COVAX as an insurance policy. Many people have begged to differ. I think, attrition rates for vaccine development are very high. So, I'm not going to pass judgment on the US's decision about taking care of the US population. But it is the fact that COVAX has the world's largest portfolio of funded vaccines. I'll just mention that. The US could still contribute through there is a mechanism to provide funding to support the delivery of vaccines to lower and lower middle income countries. And we are certainly hoping that the United States will see fit to participate and will understand from an enlightened self-interest perspective that stopping the pandemic everywhere is in the interest of the United States, and that can only be done through a global distribution of vaccine. I don't want to speculate on China's decision.
Oh, I see. I just wanted to ask you, the same thinking prevails in China? You don't want to?
Well, I was trying to be brief in my remarks, but I think China is in a very similar situation. They've got a large number of vaccines that are being developed in China. They have 4 vaccine candidates that are in phase 3 clinical trials right now. So they have some of the leading vaccine candidates. And they also have no COVID-19 disease to speak of in China. So they have controlled the disease very well. And it may be that they have decided, that as the United States, they are sufficiently well situated to depend on their own vaccine production. I will say that President Xi, unlike President Trump, has declared that he wants the Chinese vaccines to serve the needs of the world and to become global public goods to help. So it is quite possible that China may ultimately, support COVAX efforts through contribution of vaccines or funds for developing countries. Remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Richard. And that brings us to our next speaker, Dr. Deborah Seligsohn. Deborah is a political science professor at Villanova University near Philadelphia. And formerly, she worked in the State Department, and she was, for example, Counselor for Environment, Science, Technology, and Health at the American Embassy in Beijing. So no surprise that Deborah is a China expert, so we will ask similar questions to you. And Deborah also worked for the World Resources Institute, and her introductory remarks today are entitled Enhancing US-China Health and Research Cooperation. Over to you, Deborah.
Thanks. So US-China cooperation is kind of at a nadir right now. So almost anything we do would be enhancing it, I'm afraid. We came to this COVID crisis with a number of developments that have really hurt the US-China's science relationship on the public health side, on the research side. I mean, firstly, on the public health side, the US withdrew almost all of its personnel from China between 2017 and 2019, so that very few of our CDC and other US government staff were there, which was not at all helpful. So that was kind of the first thing. I mean, that goes along with the fact that, President Trump got rid of the Pandemic Preparedness Office in the National Security Council so that we weren't prepared at the top. And in terms of our emerging infections program, run by mostly CDC with NIH involvement as well around the world, it had been in about 45 countries and they pulled it back to less than 10. So the sort of skepticism about the need for global public health efforts was pretty broad-based, but it definitely encompassed China, and it left us essentially blind on the ground at the beginning of COVID. So that was one piece of it. The second piece was that for about a year and a half of the Trump administration, we had no US-China science and technology umbrella agreement. It seems like it was basically such a low priority in the National Security Council, they just didn't do it. And they finally did get it done in the fall right before COVID started, which is good, but a pretty strong signal to the Chinese that the US wasn't putting a great deal of effort into science and technology cooperation. And this is particularly striking because this was the first agreement signed between the US and China in 1979 after normalization of the relationship. Science and technology cooperation has been the ballast of the relationship. It has been the thing that has continued through all the ups and downs of the relationship. And there's been a strong recognition by administrations from both parties of the value of working together on science and technology, and in no area was that importance recognized more heavily than in health. So that was kind of a big loss. And then the third is the way the Department of Justice's China initiative is being run. So this is an initiative that was launched in November 2018 by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions that was concerned with intellectual property theft and concerns about Chinese espionage. And while these are indeed important issues, the way it's been managed has made many scientists, especially scientists of Chinese origin, but not only anymore, extremely nervous about cooperation between the US and China. This is partly because of fairly broad definitions of what might be illegal sharing. It's also because I think a lot of the FBI folks who are implementing it, because it's been delegated to all of FBI's district offices, have no training in science and technology and often have a great deal of difficulty differentiating between what is novel, what is not novel, and a general tendency to assume that anything that's really cutting edge coming from China must have been stolen, which is not true. The Chinese now have world-class capacity in many areas. So the combination of less than full-throated government support for a long tradition of cooperation, combined with skepticism about the value of that cooperation, has really, I think, been a significant impediment. And actually, I think especially looking forward, if it isn't addressed, becomes an ever greater impediment and frankly, a risk to US science. I mean, most labs in the United States have graduate students from China. Many of those students then go on to continue to work in the US, and there's enormous concern within the Chinese American community about whether this is a viable future or not. So I really think if we want the US to continue to be the preeminent science power that it is, this is a really important issue to consider. What we've seen in the case of COVID was that we really did see a misunderstanding in the United States of Chinese capacity, right? While there clearly was on the epidemiological side, a couple of weeks cover up of cases in early January, the Chinese were clearly pursuing their science very fast, and they published the genome on January 10th. It's striking that there was a letter from CDC Director Robert Redfield to the Chinese CDC Director George Gao on January 6th, offering US CDC help in determining the genome. Clearly, that help was not needed. And I think that reflects an assumption of capacity that goes back to where we were during SARS in 2003, when the Chinese really did need that help. But 2003 turns out to be 17 years ago, and Chinese science has moved quite rapidly in those years, often on the basis of projects that we worked on together. I mean, China's ability in genomics was fostered by the Human Genome Project that they were a big part of. So I think recognizing Chinese capacity was a huge problem. Clearly, the Chinese got COVID under control as fast and as well as any country in the world. It is important to note that outside of Wuhan and Hubei province, China had 30 provinces that controlled the rate of infection, as well as any of the countries that we hold up as exemplars, whether that be South Korea or New Zealand or Vietnam. So I think we could have learned a great deal more from them than we did on the public health side. But when I've talked, and I've done a ton of interviews over the summer, what Chinese scientists say is they want more cooperation on treatment, and they want more cooperation on vaccines, that they think that's actually important. And there's still, I think at the professional level, enormous reservoirs of goodwill on both sides. And so I think it's really important for us thinking into the future to think about how governments can support that and promote that cooperation, because I think the interest is still really there and would be of value. You raised the issue earlier of vaccine safety and concern, and I think it's worth noting that in China, as in the United States, there's a great deal of vaccine anxiety and skepticism among the general public. And there have been some really big scares in recent years about childhood immunization. And so firstly, I think this does mean that the Chinese are going to certainly try to do everything they can to show that it's safe. But I think it also means that that may be one of the reasons why they're actually perfectly willing to share some vaccine with other countries, because given the fact that they've done such a good job controlling it on their own, I'm not sure that they think they're going to get a rapid rollout or rapid uptake within the country. It may be slow going. Another thing worth noting is, you know, there's where the vaccines are developed, and I would really be interested in hearing Richard talk more about this later. There's also production capacity. And the whole effort of Gavi was to create increased vaccine production capacity in developing countries. And so I wonder, you know, that's why China is now the world's biggest vaccine producer, but it's not just China, it's India, it's Brazil, it's lots of other places. And so I wonder if there isn't a need to separate the IP of the vaccines from where they're produced to promote use around the world. And I think lastly, just talking about the World Health Organization, the Chinese have remained committed to the World Health Organization as the US has announced its intentions to pull out. I mean, obviously, I think if we have a new president in January, that's not going to happen. If we don't, it seems quite likely that it will. This has been a consistent and clear strategy from President Xi to all of President Trump's anti-globalist announcements, right? I mean, President Xi started this at Davos before President Trump even came into office, redoubling his commitment to the international system, be that the trading system, be that climate change, and committing to WHO fits right in with that. I think they increased funding after the US announced its intention to pull out. So I think the Chinese do see some advantages in terms of relationships around the world in being seen as part of the global system and a team player. But while that clearly is a place where they see some advantages to one-upsmanship over the United States, I think when it comes to actually fighting disease, the people who do that in China are genuinely interested in working in collaboration with people in the US. And I do think if there is a new administration, there's a huge opportunity there for closer collaboration on many fronts.
Thank you very much indeed. It's most interesting. Let me ask you, as you know, the Trump administration constantly accuses China of being responsible for the virus. And there are various conspiracy theories around, particularly on the internet, which says Chinese scientists, if not the government, deliberately launched that virus onto the world via that lab in Wuhan. Can you clarify the situation for us once and for all? How responsible and in what, or to what degree is China responsible for the virus and for the spread of the virus? Give us some clarity here.
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that the Chinese also accused the U.S. Army of fabricating the virus.
That's very true. Yes.
So this is quite a bit of a tit-for-tat situation in terms of disinformation on both sides. The U.S. has been more persistent in this. Once the Chinese got their own disease under control, they didn't seem to feel a need to continue to blame others. But you know, I mean, I think the best publication on this is the Nature Medicine article in March by Anderson et al. That basically suggests that the idea that it was deliberate seems very unlikely, and even the idea of a lab leak seems like the least likely, and that they had a couple of different theories of when the jump came from animals and where the jump was, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot that's just not known, but I think the more we see that cases were much earlier than people knew, it had already moved around the world much earlier than people knew. I mean, we're talking. So they've now identified cases in LA and in Washington State in December. So, you know, the thing is, in terms of the Chinese failing to identify it, so did our doctors. It turns out to have been really hard to identify. And the Chinese did a pretty good job of identifying it pretty quickly, but you know, it still took time, and it took even more time to understand that it was being transmitted asymptomatically and airborne and all the other problems that we have.
Apparently, there was a deliberate delay by the Wuhan authorities to inform the central government in Beijing for possibly local reasons, for career reasons, things like that.
It looks like 1 to 2 weeks in the second and third week of January was possibly a deliberate delay. If you look at what was happening before that, since the Wuhan government did actually post it, remember this accusation that they found it out from the Wuhan government website. They put it in public. This is the World Health Organization, the way they saw it originally. But it seems like in December there was a fight going on among doctors in Wuhan. Was it new? Was it not new? Was it serious? Was it, I mean, the usual stuff that you would get with a brand new disease. And then they figured it out, they posted it, they started reporting cases, and then there's this period when the case reporting stopped. What's interesting is they were still working on the genome, they were still working on everything else. I think this does reflect a tendency within the Chinese bureaucracy to want to tell your boss everything's under control. So boss, we have this new disease, but don't worry, we got it covered. It's all going to be okay. As you probably know, this kind of cover-up is actually pretty common around the world. Even the current head of the World Health Organization was accused of executing a cover-up in his home country. I would be shocked if there were such an outbreak, you know, in a US beach community in the middle of the summer, if the mayor didn't try to hide it. You know, local government officials have their economic reasons for trying to do this. And that's why the World Health Organization beefed up its regulations after SARS. And you know, it was interesting because I had an interview with former Prime Minister Brundtland a couple of weeks ago, and she kind of wondered whether the tougher regulations actually constrained the WHO DG. She's like, I didn't have any rules, so I could kind of do it the way I wanted at the time. So I think it's always a challenge. I do think that, I mean, it appears the local government was trying to hide things. You know, the idea that cases would drop to zero seems like any epidemiologist would think that was unlikely. So how much the central government was pushing back, I don't think we know yet. But what I do think in terms of the actual origins is that's about science. And the way we're going to find out is the way normal science works, where all kinds of people are going to be doing various genetic investigations, and it may take quite a long time. Look how many years it took us to understand exactly where AIDS came from.
Thank you very much. And that brings me to our final speaker tonight, and that is a speaker who will mention the hard science, I trust, and we'll talk about hard science. And our final speaker tonight is Dr. Salli Permar. Salli is a professor of pediatrics, of molecular genetics, and microbiology, of immunology and pathology. In short, she's an expert on the evolution of vaccines and of the human immune system. Today, Salli will talk about lessons from children, SARS and COVID-19 immunity, and the vaccine outlook for children. Salli Permar, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in with this very distinguished panel. And I'm learning so much already because while I work on the immunology and the virology, it's a whole nother ballgame getting the vaccine to everyone who needs it, as you've been hearing. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can show a little bit of data. And I'm really going to focus on the vaccines, the different types of vaccines that are moving through the pipeline, and what are the nuances with each of these platforms, and then also what the outlook is for children in a need for a vaccine even there. So, I don't have the ability to share screen right now. Sorry.
Really? Mm.
You need to make her a co-host.
I think co-host, yeah.
Let me see how to do that. You should be a co-host now.
Okay, let me try. Yeah. Okay. And I'll put it on presentation. Does this look okay?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay. So the name of the game for a vaccine right now is to develop antibodies against that red spike protein. So the coronavirus there, that's given its name because of that red protein that sticks way out from the membrane called the spike protein. And we know that if you can make an antibody response that come from your immune cells and circulate in the plasma, if that antibody can bind to that spike protein and not allow the virus to attach to its cellular receptor, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme, or known as ACE2 receptor, that's on many cells throughout our body, then the virus is unable to continue to replicate. So that is the goal of a coronavirus vaccine, at least these first generations. So there are, and like everyone has been saying, the science and how quickly it has moved and how many vaccine platforms we have and how many really promising vaccines we have for COVID in less than 9 months of knowing about this virus, I think is really remarkable. And it's something that I hope will be a golden age, the beginning of a golden age for vaccine development. And we now know what's possible if we put enough funding behind it and have enough will and expertise. So this is, thanks to the New York Times, a display of all the different types of platforms that are moving forward. I will go through most of them in more detail. So one of the first types of vaccines that are moving forward is the genetic-based vaccines. Genetic-based vaccines are either made out of RNA, the nucleic acid that actually can go on to produce proteins, or DNA, which is the step before RNA, where the DNA is the gene that will transcribe the RNA and then make protein. These are somewhat newer vaccine platforms. For DNA, that was kind of the new vaccine platform when I was training, so maybe 20 years ago now. The RNA is a newer vaccine platform, maybe only around for the last 5 or 10 years or so. So one of the leading candidates here is the Moderna that's already been mentioned, one that was quick to get into clinical trials. And one huge advantage of these types of vaccines is that they can go immediately from the sequence to a vaccine candidate. And that is a big advantage. They also have a manufacturing advantage where you don't have to include cells in your manufacturing that are going to produce a protein or produce a virus. They can be made as just naked nucleic acid, and you don't have to grow cells as part of the manufacturing. Because these vaccines are so rapid to develop a first clinical product and have been so promising, you see a number of companies that are pursuing this type of vaccine, with Moderna being the one that has one of the leading candidates. One thing that's exciting to me is that while mRNA has been in several adult clinical trials, there previously hadn't been any pediatric studies, but they recently have a new toddler mRNA vaccine for respiratory virus parainfluenza. So this is a little bit of data from the Moderna vaccine. And again, this was a collaboration with the NIH that had been working on different constructs for the spike protein for a SARS-1 virus, the original virus that was a novel coronavirus that created an epidemic around China about 17 years ago. So the NIH had some expertise here and got together with Moderna to design a sequence that would be able to make an mRNA that then is encapsulated in a lipid nanoparticle. And then when it's injected into a muscle, the muscle cells take up that mRNA and then can express this spike protein. And this is nice that the cells do the work for you. This is some data here on one of the first clinical trials that has been published on from the Moderna vaccine, showing different doses that were used in the human subjects and comparing it to patients that have been previously infected with SARS-CoV-2, who are the convalescent patients on the right. And you can see that all of the doses really get into the range of neutralizing antibodies. This is a measure of neutralizing antibodies, get into a range that you see with infected people, but at the top end of the range, which is what we're looking for. There was some issues with reactogenicity of the highest dose, even some systemic effects like fever, chills, but the lower doses had less of that. And so that's where the current trials are using these lower doses. Another type of vaccine that's actively being pursued is the viral vector vaccines. And so these are vaccines that will employ an attenuated, sort of, harmless virus for a human infection. And they will use that virus and its ability to infect cells and start to express proteins. They'll use that as a way to express the protein, the spike protein on the coronavirus, so that your immune system can respond to that. So one of the leading candidates here is AstraZeneca, which was a collaboration with the University of Oxford that was using a special attenuated or innocuous virus, which this one was a chimp adenovirus. So in addition to using a virus that it can have low pathogenicity in humans, they also used a chimpanzee version to, again, further attenuate the possibility of any harm from the virus vector. And this one, maybe you recently read about more recently because of its pause that it had to take. So there was a case of transverse myelitis, which is can be a temporary paralysis where you get some inflammation around the spinal cord. And it was unclear if this was related to the vaccine or just happened as a coincidence. It's a pretty rare type of a disease that comes up, and sometimes we don't know what even causes that disease. They've since moved on in the trial, so it's clear that their experts have looked at the data and thought that it was unrelated to the vaccine. Maybe they had a cause in this patient of what that event was. But this is another type of vaccine. Again, was also, this type of vaccine was used in the Ebola vaccine pursuit as well. And here's a little bit of data from this viral vector vaccine. Again, this is the chimp adenovirus from AstraZeneca and University of Oxford. In red is the immune responses from vaccinees, and in green is again, the neutralizing antibodies from infected individuals. You can see that after 2 doses here, they did get into the range of neutralizing antibodies that you see in infected individuals. And so that's good news that that type of potentially protective response is elicited. And both the mRNA vaccines and AstraZeneca have had trials or studies in non-human primates that showed them to be protective as well. So a more tried and true type of vaccine platform are these protein-based vaccines. And a prototype here is the Novovax vaccine. This is in which you don't give the genetic material for the protein to be produced by the body's cells. You're actually giving the protein itself. And this is used in other types of vaccines that we administer routinely, like the hepatitis B vaccine. A more recent one that you may have even experienced is the new shingles vaccine, is based on a single protein from the virus that is also typically combined with a strong adjuvant. An adjuvant is a sort of viscous type of substance that is used to draw immune cells into the area that can pick up this vaccine and then start the immune response. And there's been a revolution in our adjuvants recently, where we've gone from just alum-based adjuvants that were used for decades into some biology of understanding the way that the signals work for immune cells to come into an area and be able to take up a new antigen and take it back to the lymph node. And the toll-like receptor agonist is the name of the type of substances that are now used in these adjuvants, which again are actually pieces of various pathogens, bacteria, and viruses that are, again, innocuous, but are used as a way to signal the immune cells to come into the area. And so there are a number of protein-based vaccines that are also in manufacturing now. They are longer have a longer road for manufacturing generally than a genetic-based vaccine. Again, they have to have cells produce the protein. There's a long quality control process. But they are more tried and true in having several candidates that are licensed vaccine in this platform. And so, we've already talked about, many of the panelists, that the manufacturing process is actually probably going to be longer and more complex than the trials process. And so generally this is where 70% of the time for making a vaccine lies, is within the manufacturing and even the delivery. But of course, what's been going on, especially from the US government and from other groups like Sept, is trying to decrease the time for manufacturing by investing now in producing millions of doses now that will allow for a quick distribution of the vaccine once efficacy and safety is proven. So other remaining risks, though, once the clinical trials are done, and hopefully we have a few effective candidates that did not have any major safety signals, is continuing to look for risks of vaccine-associated safety events. And so one that we always think about as vaccinologists is that there have been cases of vaccine-associated enhanced respiratory disease in our history with respiratory virus vaccines like the measles vaccine, the respiratory syncytial virus vaccines. When these were first put out as killed vaccines or inactivated virus vaccines, they actually elicited some types of immune responses that upon exposure to the actual virus after being vaccinated, you could have more severe lung disease than if you had no vaccine at all. And so that's something in all respiratory infections that we think about to look out for. And there's also a type of vaccine-enhanced illness or disease that has come up with the dengue vaccine, which is antibody-enhanced disease, where if your antibodies elicited don't completely neutralize the virus, they may actually help the virus get into cells and replicate. That has not been a problem that has been found with coronaviruses yet, but something that did show up in the dengue vaccine pursuit. But one potentially worrisome thing is in COVID vaccine development in mice, or this was actually the original SARS-1 vaccine development in mice. There was some suggestion of vaccine-enhanced disease in the lungs, where mice that received a live attenuated vaccine, so this is a coronavirus that's been attenuated over time, was given to the mice. Upon exposure to the virus, they actually had some more severe lung disease than those mice that did not have any vaccination. And this is why live attenuated coronavirus vaccines are not really on the table, is because of this possibility. Another hurdle will be the durability. So right now we're hearing a lot about the durability of natural immunity to this infection, that it seems like it is possible to become reinfected, how widespread reinfection is, and whether you can transmit to another person after being infected. I don't think we have a good handle on that yet. But another thing to watch with these vaccines that's not going to come out of the original trials is the durability. How long will the protection last? And we have a number of vaccines that have durable responses, like measles, rubella. Those are lifelong. Tetanus is more than 10 years. HPV is turning out to be very durable. But we have some that have very short durability, and they're problematic in terms of disease control, which is like pertussis and flu. We know we have to get that vaccine every year. So just as a pediatrician, I think a lot about how we can protect children, but also how protecting children really contribute to containing the epidemic in general. So children, as you probably have heard, are often asymptomatic with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and so therefore they are likely spreading infection without knowing. And there was some suggestion that maybe children contributed less to transmission, and I think that's still the case, that young children don't seem to transmit as much as older children or adults, but they are still spreading the infection. A pediatric vaccine would, be critical to preventing any severe cases of COVID in children, which have occurred. We have had children land in the hospital from acute infection, but also this interesting inflammatory syndrome that came on, the multi-inflammatory syndrome in children, or the MIS-C, that sort of peaked following the surge of the original coronavirus cases in US cities, but is continuing to come in at a slow rate now, that some proportion, maybe 1 in 1,000 children, will go on to have an inflammatory disease where they can be hospitalized. We know that childhood vaccines actually get much higher coverage than adults. So pediatricians and our systems that are set up in throughout the world are really focused on immunization in the under 5 group. And so putting a vaccine in a pediatric schedule immediately gets much higher coverage than any adult schedule. Schools could open if we did have a coronavirus vaccine for children, which we know is harming children in many other ways than just preventing the infection. Children are not learning as well as they are able to in person. The education gap is widening. Depression, obesity are things that are going to be other epidemics we're dealing with without schools being open. And then interestingly, what I study a lot is the immune environment of children is very different than adults. And children often get the bad reputation that their immune response is still developing and therefore not as robust as an adult immune system, but it's actually more complicated than that. There are many types of responses that children make that are actually better and more durable than adults. And one area that I've studied is HIV vaccines in children, and we have found that children, they're shown in red, getting a vaccine that's very similar to the protein-based vaccine with a potent adjuvant, that they had 20-fold higher magnitude responses compared to the adults shown there in blue, and they still had 5-fold higher magnitude responses a year later after vaccination, when the adults, most of them had waned. So children can actually have a potentially more durable and higher magnitude response to these types of vaccines that are going forward for coronavirus. And then we are studying that, and this is actually a collaboration with UNC as well as UC Davis. We are studying some of the leading candidate vaccines in non-human primate models. Again, one of the key models that has emerged for coronavirus. And so that's at least a way that we can show that the pediatric immune system will respond well to these types of vaccines. However, this is still a long way from clinical trials, and no pediatric clinical trials are moving forward at this point, again, endangering that we will come to fall 2021 with no clinical trials finished for children and still be dealing with the issues of schools opening. So just in summary, so you've heard here that it's remarkable how quickly these SARS-CoV-2 vaccine candidates have come through, and licensure may happen within 12 months of starting the race. But there's a lot of hurdles that remain, and it's a good thing there's likely to be several candidates because, again, some candidates may have various issues that don't come up until way after the trials, and so there can be another one that's there waiting in the wings, or even the manufacturing issues that may come up. It's good that we have many candidates. The safety studies will be critical, and again, I firmly believe that we need to go through the full clinical trials and safety evaluations before any approval should be given. And we already have distrust in vaccines, and putting out a vaccine too early without all the safety hurdles being crossed may erode that even further. And we know that kids can respond well to the types of vaccines that are being developed, and therefore it may be an important population to consider in the vaccine, that where the vaccine will live eventually, but also where the vaccine will go to really contain this epidemic. And then, of course, it's really important to continue the partnerships with academic medical centers and pharma, and these very critical public-private partnerships like Sept that are helping with all of the hurdles that are going to come up in terms of vaccine manufacturing, delivery, and the vaccine science. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much indeed. Very enlightening. If you wanted to guess which vaccine you would think might be developing first, or which company would, be successful in the race, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I do think the mRNA vaccine at Moderna certainly had an edge. Maybe the other mRNA candidates, Pfizer, I believe is the other one, have an edge because of they were quick to the clinical trial grade material, and they may be quick to developing those hundreds of millions of doses. So I have my eye on them as a leading candidate. But I'm also cheering for the protein-based vaccines because I think they may have less surprises in the up to in terms of safety, in terms of manufacturing, compared to those newer platforms.
Thank you. Remind us, how do we actually catch a COVID-19 infection? And what about that famous word, herd immunity? Are we there yet? Will we ever get there? And then perhaps also briefly, what about the drugs which do not prevent the infection, but help us to survive the infection?
Yeah. So yeah, we have come a very long way since, January, February 2020 in terms of our knowledge. I still remember when many of our public health officials told people not to wear masks, and now we tell them wear masks all the time. So yeah, we clearly have evolved on our knowledge and understanding. So yeah, I think it's becoming pretty clear from the epidemiology, from the study of the virus itself, that aerosol transmission is probably the main route. And so
breathing, singing, speaking.
Yeah, being in a room with someone and being unmasked, being indoors, yeah, singing, speaking, the household transmission is very big. And so we know how to prevent it. That's the good news. We know how to prevent it. Wear a mask, space out, be outdoors as much as possible. That will be harder with winter. We do know how to prevent it. And I think workplaces and schools can be successful if you really stay vigilant. So that's how you can avoid it. Now, also good news is the death rate per number of cases does seem to be improving significantly. Some of that with younger individuals being more often infected now, but some of it is because of the drugs that we have on hand that we're able to use. Of course, the antiviral remdesivir, that really UNC was a leader in having that drug available on the table as a candidate from the SARS-1 treatment explorations that they did. And so that is one that's even more widely available now than it was a few months ago. And then just regular old steroid treatment, which is something that is very cheap, used throughout the world, used in many diseases. That has also been shown to be helpful, with a number of other that are still in the pipeline for showing whether they're effective or not. So yes, the death rate is certainly going down as well.
And herd immunity, is that what we're going to develop?
Herd immunity, yes. So herd immunity is a little tougher because I think we don't really understand the durability of the immunity quite yet. With the calculated or the estimated number of people that each person will infect if they are infected, or the R naught is the name of that value, is at a level that we think an estimate is maybe more than half, maybe up to 70% of individuals in the community will have to be immune before the number of cases will go down. That number that you infect after being an infected person is less than 1. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that herd immunity is rising with infections, but how durable it is, we don't know. And there's some concerning reports of reinfection now. And so this, I think it means that from the vaccine, we will probably need at least half of individuals vaccinated before we see a major effect.
Yeah, thank you very much. Perhaps I'll ask just one general question to all of our panelists before we open it to questions from the audience. And that question would be, when, from your knowledge, the aspects you have studied in that wide field, when do you think we will have a vaccine available? And will that mean that we are actually able to go back to normal as we were living maybe in 2019 and 2018? Or has the world changed for good because of what is happening to us now? Tom, do you want to address that first?
Sure, although Richard is a lot closer to where the candidates are and which one is likely to succeed than I am. So I will, he's a better handicapper of when we might see. I do think we'll see results from the Moderna and Pfizer trials. I think people expect to see that in the fourth quarter. What that means in terms of when it gets emergency use authorization, when it gets approval, we'll see. As some of you may have seen, the FDA has potentially updated its emergency use authorization standards, and that people believe that might extend the process. The other candidate that people are watching is the AstraZeneca Oxford candidate, but they've now had 2 episodes of that rare condition that Professor Permar mentioned, and that some of you may have seen. Given that it's quite rare, 2 episodes really has spooked people. The US, for instance, has not allowed the trial to restart. So I don't know exactly what that will do to its time frame. Will it allow life to return to normal? Not likely, for a couple of reasons. One, the vaccines are likely to be partially protective. They may only be protective against disease, not infection. So it may be more like your flu shot than a vaccine that can give sterilizing immunity and allow from that perspective. So it may be that this virus continues to circulate for some time. Based on what we saw in testing in this country, I think there's going to be some hiccups in terms of our ability to ramp up and deliver the vaccine. So this is not going to be a quick fix. Historically, we do a terrible job of vaccinating adults. So how that will happen in this case will take some time given those the populations that would be prioritized. But that's my quick reactions there. But again, I'm sure both on the science side of returning to normal and on knowing where the development are, the other panelists will know more.
Richard, do you want to come in as well? Thank you very much.
Sure. No, this is kind of the $1 million question, right?
That's the reason why I asked it.
I think Tom's guess with respect to when we might see the first efficacy results is right. I would say later this year is possible, very possible, given that the Pfizer and Moderna phase 3 trials are well underway, almost fully enrolled. Whether FDA issues an emergency use authorization is certainly, up to them. The emergency use authorization was created to allow FDA, based on their assessment of the risk-benefit ratio, to make a determination that a vaccine that has not fully met the criteria for licensure, that ratio of risk and benefit favors early use. Typically, FDA has indicated that they will want to see 6 months of safety data for people who've been vaccinated. So these trials started, I think the Moderna trial started at the end of July. So licensure under the criteria that FDA has established, really you're looking at possibly in the first quarter or even later of next year. But emergency use authorization before the end of the year is still a possibility. That would not mean that it would be vaccines would be rolled out broadly. I think that would, that emergency use vaccine would be reserved for high priority populations, perhaps healthcare workers, perhaps those at greatest risk of severe illness and death. Many other vaccines are likely to meet criteria for efficacy and ultimately potentially for safety in the first half of 2021. I think Tom is right. I think it's going to take time to vaccinate the population. Uptake may be variable depending on the public's trust. And I think we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 as an endemic disease for a long, long time.
So no possibility to travel to China, Deborah?
Well, I think that we need to remember that vaccines are not the only way to return to normal. I mean, I'm involved in a US-China science and technology policy dialogue right now, where the Americans are all in our little screens on Zoom, and our Chinese counterparts are sitting around a conference table in Beijing, all sitting together next to each other, no masks, looking absolutely normal. So, back in April-ish, people in China were saying they were going out, but they were nervous and whatever. At this point, life in China is basically normal, and they have a sufficiently rapid monitoring that whenever a case crops up, they close down this very specific area. They test absolutely everybody in the area, and they isolate cases, and they get it eradicated, and they go back to normal. And they've now done this at least 4 different times in geographic locations as diverse as Beijing and Yunnan. So we need to have a proper testing and monitoring system. And, you know, I'm intrigued by the kind of rapid test advocacy that, you know, Harvard School of Public Health has advocated, University of Illinois has developed a rapid test. And, you know, this idea that if we all could just basically give ourselves a little rapid test in the morning, and if we're clean, we go out, and if we're not, we stay home and call the doctor, you know, we could get this whole thing under control in 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a question of political will. I mean, that's, I think, why politics always matters. You know, countries, very diverse countries with very different systems have managed to get this under control. And our problem is that we have destroyed our public health system. You know, after the 2008 crash, state and local governments underfunded public health. The CDC was way understaffed at the beginning of this because of Trump administration staffing cuts. And then we had no leadership. So we both hollowed out the bottom, the middle, and the top at the moment. But it doesn't have to be that way. We still are one of the world's richest, we're the world's richest country. We can do this if we want to.
Thank you. Salli, would you agree with that?
Yes, I do think there's a lot of avenues we could get to going to life, maybe not completely normal come next year, but something that would be more than us all sitting on a Zoom all the time. And that is testing, more rapid testing. I mean, I think about pediatricians' offices this fall. If you could go in and get an answer, whether you had COVID or not, like you do strep, that would be a huge benefit to just getting kids, you know, back to school and knowing which families have to quarantine, which don't. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's going to be a hectic year because these vaccines are going to be all over the place. There may be one that gets licensed, goes out into the population, and then gets pulled back for a phase 4 type safety signal, and then we have to, you know, de-recommend that one, go to another one. So it's going to be a hectic year. I am telling people, I think you'll be holding onto your mask at least till 2022.
Mm-hmm. What about these quick tests? You know, you have a test in 15 minutes and then you know whether you're positive or negative. Isn't that the way forward for schools, universities, theaters, almost anything?
It would change how we're living, certainly, if that was available, you know, that they were.
But isn't it available? I hear it's already available, no?
Yes, that is true. And I think the landscape, I don't know the testing landscape as well, but it is changing, you know, within every week, probably. And yeah, I think expense, you know, right now, most of them are still PCR based, which means you have to have a machine. Whereas if it could be just like a pregnancy test, you know, that's the type of test that we need. And I'm not sure those are quite there yet to be validated and out on the market.
Thank you,
Richard. That's what the University of Illinois is using is rapid test. The issue is it hasn't been pushed by the government, and nobody's pushed like massive manufacturing scale up. The idea, I mean, if you really had massive procurement, you could drive the price down and you could make it cheap enough to use them every day. And that's what we need, but it requires a commitment to the procurement and to, you know, distribution and all those wonderful things.
Would that be the future, Richard, together perhaps with a vaccine? Have both?
Well, I mean, I want to underscore the point that was made that vaccines are certainly not a panacea. I mean, vaccines will contribute to control, and, you know, having rapid antigen tests that are cheap and affordable and widely accessible would certainly help tremendously. Having effective therapeutics that take, you know, the fear out of the disease, so that we can treat people who do get sick are going to be critically important. I mean, I think there are an array of what we call medical countermeasures that we need. We also need people to accept, as Salli was suggesting, we are going to need to hold on to our masks for a while and behave responsibly, and probably, have some long-term behavioral changes to accommodate to minimize risk.
Tom, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think all that makes sense. I'll add two things. On the rapid testing on the antigen side, one of the problem is that in terms of the pregnancy type test now, they're not that sensitive. So people, it's one thing if it's a false positive, people just stay home from work, to use your analogy. The question is false negatives and whether people take confidence from the tests and do things that may not be warranted. So what they're trying to do is, the issue is, can they be validated and improved, like Salli had mentioned before. I completely agree that vaccines are not the only solution, and waiting for one to occur has been one of our big problems in the US. I will say not only is it wrong for the reasons that Deborah mentioned, that other countries have managed to do this without a vaccine, it's also ahistorical. Most of our progress that we've made in this country against infectious disease occurred before the availability of most vaccines and the public availability of antibiotics. We did it through public health. A lot of the measures that China has used successfully, other countries have used successfully, have existed really since the 14th century. We have just proven unable to deploy them. So that doesn't need to remain the case, but there is something to say for the difficult record we've had in this country. And unlike other countries that manage to suppress community transmission relatively early and control it, we really do have quite a burden of cases and have our work cut out for us to get that back under control.
Thank you very much. I think we should need to come to the Q&A part of the evening. Anna, would you like to ask a question? You have selected a question from the ones submitted in writing?
Yes, I think we're just going to go in the order that they were submitted. Our first question is from His
It's the most interesting ones, please.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll go with the first one. Okay. It's submitted by His Excellency Oswaldo de Riviero, Ambassador from Peru. And he requests a reaction to the recent proposal from the President of Peru that the United Nations General Assembly adopt a resolution declaring the vaccine a public good for humanity. And I think just a general analysis of how that would affect the current situation and the distribution of the vaccine.
Is that addressed to anyone in particular?
I think it was addressed to Tom Bollyky. It was during his presentation.
Bollyky. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the more world leaders express the importance to look at vaccine distribution as a public health matter, the better. This virus clearly knows no borders. Our response to it shouldn't. And that is true for the sharing of vaccines. The one thing I worry a little bit about on the public good language is I really do think it's important that people understand that initial supplies will in fact be limited. And the decisions we make with what to do with those supplies will affect the ability of others to get them. So public good means something in particular. And these vaccines are not, unfortunately, those. But in terms of expressing the importance of taking sharing those vaccines in a public health-driven response, that's critical. And I commend the statement before the UN on that regard.
Thank you. Laurel, would you like to ask the next question?
Sure. There were two of them that kind of hit on the same point.
I think Deborah may have wanted to follow up on that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I overlooked you, Deborah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hold on.
Yeah, I want to argue a little with Tom about this public good argument. So Vaccines are like education. They both have a private good aspect because they help you, but they also have a public good aspect because they benefit society, right? The herd immunity part of it, and the fact that if we get 50 or 60% of us vaccinated, it protects all the other people, including those that don't get vaccinated. And especially in terms of thinking about the distribution, the early distribution of vaccines when they're short, you know, if it's in a carefully planned way where healthcare providers and other people that really need it first get it, that has enormous public good aspects to it. So I don't think that the Peruvian government in proposing this resolution was incorrect in asserting the public good importance of it. I do think the UN General Assembly, unfortunately, will have little influence on the behavior of the United States in particular. I also think that, you know, the World Health Organization has been the main body that has addressed these things, and it is certainly where a great deal of expertise is held and respected. So I think that sort of pushing for the US to re-engage with the WHO and the efforts that are happening there on talking about how to distribute it are probably the most critical.
Yeah. So I would agree that certainly herd immunity is a public good, and certainly public health benefits are something that we should desire. The issue of my emphasizing that its supplies are limited is we have some really hard decisions to make. And it's important that politicians educate their public that, for instance, in the US, if we seek to vaccinate everyone prior to sharing, that will leave less vaccines for other nations. If other countries seize it and do the same, it'll leave less vaccines for other nations. If we're not educating people on what the public health priorities should be on allocation and why that would afford us some ability to share, we have to start making those hard decisions. And I worry to some degree that we're not having that conversation. We're not doing the research to generate those allocation priorities. And in the absence of that, it's we're unfortunately, those decisions are not moving forward.
Thank you. Laurel now.
Okay, so two questions kind of hit on the same topic, one from Zach Markin and another from Dr. Philip Blatt, a retired MD. Basically, their question revolved around what would you tell a skeptical public to ensure them that a vaccine is safe to take? And what will it take to regain the trust of many Americans regarding vaccination?
Interesting question. Who would like to address it? Richard?
Sure. No, I'll jump in. The question of what will it take to make Americans be confident in vaccines again, that's a hard question. What I will say is that with respect to the vaccine development, we have treated safety as absolutely paramount. And, the way we have accelerated the vaccine development timelines, Tom mentioned, the previous record, which was for the mumps vaccine, was 4 years from isolation of the virus that went into the vaccine to delivery of a licensed product. And we're trying to do this, within a calendar year, if at all possible. The way we have done that is by compressing some of the clinical development timelines, but largely by compressing the manufacturing timelines and doing pieces of the manufacturing and the scaling up that we would ordinarily wait until we had evidence that a vaccine was working. So even though these timelines have been dramatically compressed, we are not making compromises in terms of the testing of the vaccines and the demonstration of safety in large clinical trials. The phase 3 clinical trials that are currently being done, most of them include 30,000 people. Johnson & Johnson today just announced a trial that will include 60,000 people, which is about as large a clinical trial as you can do. So the safety, if the regulatory process is not compromised for political reasons, I think the public should have confidence that the vaccines that are being delivered, have been shown to be safe. And the term phase 4 marketing commitment, post-marketing commitment was used earlier. What that is for people who don't understand the regulatory regime is after licensure, you continue to do studies as larger and larger numbers of people are exposed to make sure that really rare safety issues don't emerge. And that kind of post-licensure surveillance can continue and should continue, particularly because people are understandably concerned, seeing that the vaccine development has been accelerated. They naturally suspect that perhaps corners have been cut, and we need to reassure them that they have not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to come in?
I just want to add that I was going to make the same statement that the investments are being made to speed up the manufacturing as a way to speed the process, not in terms of shortcutting the safety. And so that needs to be a message we are sure to get out. Also, I feel good about the fact that there are many, many, many places in which the safety is being reviewed by people that don't just aren't just employed by the CDC or the FDA. It's people like me in academic centers throughout the world who are on these data science monitoring boards for each vaccine trial that advise the CDC on who should be recommended to have it, that advise the FDA. And these committees have all been set up. And so there are many, many different groups of people that are looking at the data. And that's important also.
That's pretty good to know. Thank you very much. That reassures us. Thank you. Anna, do you want to ask the next question?
Sure. So this is another for Dr. Permar. There's a question about the viral load and the mutation of the spike protein. And one of the questions is, does the virus dose inoculum affect clinical severity? And because it's been suggested that masks reduce the viral dose, and this accounts for reduced immortality. And we just want some more information about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that there is some research and some suggestions that the amount of virus you're exposed to can have a impact on the disease course. And I've even heard hypotheses that a mask may actually kind of act as a sieve for the amount of virus you may be exposed to, so that it could kind of act like its own vaccine, that you're getting exposed to an amount of virus that will not necessarily cause disease, but will might stimulate the immune system. That would be the sort of extreme view. But I think, as we know, that household transmission is pretty common. That's probably a high dose of virus that a person who you're sleeping in the same house with, interacting with, mask off consistently. And so that, but we know that there've been transmissions that happen in the workplace, that happen many desks down in a workplace. And so, so I think there's both this idea of viral dose, but also clear that it's easy to transmit even in a large room, even, across the room to someone you weren't even talking to. So still watch the research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to come in here? Or shall we go to the next question? Then Laura, would you please ask the next question?
Yep. From an anonymous attendee, they said in early September, several reports came out stating that Chinese hackers tried to hack into UNC's epidemiology network to get a hold of COVID research. Would you mind squaring with this assertion that China has sufficient ability to combat this virus on their own, and that they're actively pursuing a more globalist mindset in its virus response?
Thank you. That seems to be a question for both Tom and Deborah.
So I'm not saying by any means that there aren't nefarious actors, and I imagine there are also hackers that exist in the United States as well. I have no idea what the specific case is, or who it was that did it, or what their actual scientific background was. What I was saying was a couple things. I mean, so first of all, that China had the ability to combat the disease on its own is without question, because they basically eradicated it and and are able to control all new cases. So that's a question of epidemiology, and they've done extraordinarily well. As I said, no country does the best science if it cuts itself off from others. So many Chinese scientists are actively interested in collaborating with others. What I'm saying is that they do science at a very high level, a level at which scientists around the world want to collaborate with Chinese scientists. And we can't simply decide a priori that because the Chinese have developed these new vaccines, for example, that it was done on the basis of stolen information. You would have to know about a specific case. So that was what my point there, that there are people in the United States who simply assume any development in China that's cutting edge must be stolen. And I think that is an incorrect assumption that leads to dangerous outcomes. On the fact that Xi Jinping is both assertive in his foreign policy and interested in presenting himself as a globalist, I think both of those are true. If you look at their behavior in the South China Sea and elsewhere, I'm not making some argument that he's entirely benign. I am saying that one of the things the Chinese actively want to do is maintain an international order with things like a WHO, a WTO, a Paris Agreement, etc. And they see some advantage in looking friendly on some of these issues. So they see some political advantages to supporting WHO's efforts on some of these COVID efforts. That's all.
Tom, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I would just add a couple of things that actually continue on a similar vein. I mean, there are other reasons for Chinese government to want access to this research other than fear of what's going to happen domestically. They are very actively engaged in looking towards vaccine diplomacy. There have been huge benefits for nations in general that have done well in this pandemic, or territories, depending on how you feel about Taiwan. But New Zealand and other countries have really had benefits. China has been working with other nations, both in terms of to conduct a clinical trial, but they've reached out to the WHO on the regulatory side. I think it is clear, in part because they've done so well domestically, that they would like to do that, and that's an incentive to make sure one has the best research possible. So I don't have any insight other than the press reports about whether they've attempted this. I would just put out that I wouldn't take, if they have attempted it, purely as a sign that they're unable to control their own pandemic. I agree with Deborah on the fact that it seems quite clear that they have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is there any information available whether the US is actually cooperating with the Europeans more than with, let's say, China or other countries regarded as rivals and foes?
In general, or on vaccines?
On vaccines.
In particular. So, I mean, I think from the US perspective, a lot of the companies, historically, the pharmaceutical or the vaccine component of the pharmaceutical industry has been in the US and Europe. A lot of those ties are pretty strong. Many of the entities have different researchers or different parts of the collaborations pursuing these candidates are in both places. So I think that part is true. I don't think they're necessarily collaborating on what the distribution will be. I think the US has been quite clear on that regard. You know, the analogy that has been used publicly by an FDA official who initially led the vaccine campaign was of an oxygen mask, that the US would seek to put its own mask on first vis-a-vis vaccines before allowing others to have it. So that seems to be the policy they're taking towards everyone, including Europe. It is worth pointing out, and just to finish that analogy, as we do in the article, that oxygen masks do not only drop in first class on a plane, but that seems to be what the US has in mind for its vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. That's a good metaphor. Can we have the next question, please?
So the next one is from Andrew Richards. Last Friday, the CDC posed new guidance on its website stating that it was possible that COVID-19 could spread through airborne transmission, reflecting what he believes is the accepted science that the virus could spread through aerolized particles. The CDC reverted the page, saying that it had been updated in error. Do you think this reversion was the result of scientific disagreement or something else? And are you concerned about the political considerations affecting CDC decision-making?
Thank you. Who would like to address that? Richard, you are smiling. I think you have got something to say about it.
Well, I think having worked in the government, I think it is not outside the realm of possibility that it was simply an error, that a document was posted prematurely. I think given some of the other behaviors and things that we have seen, it raises legitimate questions about, does this represent political interference with the scientific assessment? WHO, just to point out though, the same day that the guidance went up, WHO was asked about the determination by CDC before the document was removed. Did they agree that aerosol transmission was the dominant mode of transmission? And WHO, which has not supported that position to date, said we haven't changed our position yet. Obviously, the science is still unfolding, and if circumstances change, data it demonstrates very clearly that aerosol transmission is the critical mode of transmission. We would evolve our position. So I think this is still an area of scientific debate, but there are reasons to be concerned about political interference with CDC's judgment calls.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to come in here? Maybe not. Okay, Laurel, can we have the next question?
Okay, this next one's from Laura Connaughton, a research analyst from the EU. A question for the panel on both public policy and public health aspects. On the rollout of vaccines, what about the problem of equity or quality of life if many high-risk groups are advised not to get the vaccine, such as people with autoimmune conditions in the older population, due to the lack of information on reaction or long-term impacts?
Salli, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think this is bringing up maybe two issues in clinical trials and new vaccine and therapeutic development. Is the trials are often performed in healthy 18 to maybe 55-year-olds, and that cuts out a lot of our population, the world's population. And also that they are often done in communities that are primarily Caucasian and less often involve minorities. So that is something that I do think that this vaccine pursuit is helping us, first of all, show the importance of how you have to consider the effect of these vaccines, the major impact of the virus itself in minority communities, in communities that have a lot of social determinants of health issues that are coming up for their entire, health profile. And it's helping us get over the feeling that we should just push forward trials the quickest way possible, which means healthy, middle-aged adults who, and not just have special systems set up to enroll outside of that group. And so I do think that the trials itself maybe are changing a bit because of COVID, with the highlight on including minority populations. Even elderly are being enrolled in the clinical trials now, which is often very much down the line and doesn't even happen in the licensure process generally. So that's a good thing. When it comes to distribution, that again, it's a whole nother animal when you're post clinical trials, where all of the issues that were brought up earlier of, the vaccine nationalism, the priority groups that are brought up is going to be controversial and potentially political. And so I do worry about, what the rollout is going to look like, especially in populations that are less well educated when it comes to science and the benefits of vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think we have a few more questions. But I would also like to refer to Tom Bolky, because Tom, I think you still have to leave roundabout soon. Is this correct?
I do. Unfortunately, I have another event immediately after this, and I will have to log in on that early as well. But it was nice to participate in this event. Thank you very much. Great questions from the audience and to Klaus and UNC. And always nice to see Richard, and nice to have this opportunity to work with Salli and Deborah as well. So thank you so much, and thanks to Anna and Laurel for organizing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. Perhaps we'll see you again sometime soon. Who knows? It would be nice. And I think we should go on if the other panelists agree for a few more minutes, and then I would have a final question to everyone to conclude the evening. But first, Richard wanted to come in regarding the last question.
Yeah, no, I did. I just wanted to add that thinking about vaccine development from sort of the global portfolio perspective, this issue of having vaccines that can meet the needs of all persons in society. I mean, particularly including pregnant women, the elderly, the immunocompromised, those with autoimmune conditions. By having a highly diversified portfolio and deliberately diversifying the kinds of vaccines that you have, you can develop vaccines that can meet the special needs of special populations. And I think collectively we need to do that deliberately. We don't want to leave groups behind. And so it's not going to be that there's going to be one vaccine for the world. We need to construct a portfolio of vaccines to serve the world's needs. And just to Sally's point about it is critically important to test the vaccines in diverse populations. We know that geographic differences in vaccine responsiveness exist, and that often vaccines that may perform well in European Caucasian populations do perform differently in other populations. And so having global clinical trials is critically important.
Thank you very much. Can we have another question, please?
Yes, we have two very similar or related questions from Xiaohui Wang. The first is for the RNA-based vaccines, how can we make sure that low-income countries can have the necessary equipment for correct storage and transportation of the vaccine? And the second is, will we need to develop a new vaccine for COVID-19 every year, like we do for the flu virus?
Thank you. That was raised, or I think Salli touched upon that. And didn't you say that might well be a possibility?
Well, there's two issues there. The durability of the vaccine elicited immunity, whether you'll need to boost it once a year. But I think the question was also about like the flu vaccine, will the virus genetically change quickly enough that you'll have to create a new vaccine every year? And I think some good news there is that no, we don't think that the coronavirus is changing so rapidly that we may have to create a new vaccine that quickly like you do with the flu. There's a lot of biologic reasons, like flu has 8 different genomes that can reassort, that makes it more genetically diverse each year than this coronavirus will be. There is some evidence that over time coronaviruses mutate to become less pathogenic. And in fact, those coronaviruses that cause just common colds that are circulating in our population now, they were the SARS-CoV-2 probably hundreds of years ago. So there may be mutations over time that even could make the virus less pathogenic. What we will need to look out for is whether there are changes in the virus that help it evade immunity to these vaccines. So that's something we will need to look out for. There have been some mutations that have been even picked up in the virus so far, and now they're being studied to make sure that the vaccine candidates that are out there now, can they also protect against a strain that seems to have a mutation that becomes fixed after it sets foot in a population.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to refer to?
I'll just jump in on the mRNA vaccine question. There are 2 challenges with the mRNA vaccines. One, it is a new technology, and the vaccines right now, we anticipate that they're going to be more expensive than some of the other vaccines. Some of the viral vector vaccines and the protein vaccines that were mentioned are likely to have lower cost of goods and thus be available at a lower price, which makes them more attractive in some respects for low-income countries, low-resource settings. The ultra cold chain requirements for the mRNA vaccines are really challenging. Some of the vaccines have to be stored at -70 degrees Celsius and have limited stability, maybe for a week or two after being thawed. That ultra cold chain requirement did not prevent the delivery of the Ebola vaccine to a conflict zone in Eastern Congo where more than 250,000 doses were administered. But that was a single region that was delivering vaccine, and certainly not globally. And to create that kind of ultra cold chain supply chain capacity globally would be prohibitively expensive. So I think there may be limited applications in developing countries for healthcare workers, and perhaps in urban settings where the requirements can be met, but it will be challenging to make them broadly available right now in developing countries.
Thank you very much. Perhaps one or two more questions, and then one final question from me. Laurel, I think it was your turn.
Okay, so Dr. Permar already kind of touched on this earlier, but I figured it can't help to talk about it a bit more. Dr. James Evans, retired from the Departments of Medicine and Genetics at UNC, wants to know if she can address what we know about waning of immunity in both vaccine trials and natural infections, and what that implies for vaccine development.
So we still have a lot to learn about the durability of immunity. I think from vaccine trials, we don't know anything yet. In terms of natural immunity, there have now been some genetically established reinfections. Luckily, it's a small number. Now, of course, genetically establishing a reinfection does take a lot of sampling in both times that person was maybe infected. And so it doesn't seem to be widespread, all these recounts of reinfection, but they are present. So I think the jury will be out on how natural immunity contributes to protection. One thing that I don't think we've seen at all is any antibody-enhanced disease, which would be if your antibodies wane to a certain level where they can't neutralize the virus anymore, but they can still bind the virus and maybe even help the virus infect a new set of cells, then that could be a concerning effect and something that we see with the dengue virus. But that there hasn't been any clinical or animal model evidence of that, so that's good news.
Let me just ask a question about the long-term effects of the virus. There have been all sorts of horrible stories about some people recover quickly and you never knew they actually were ill. And some people seem to have brain injury, heart injury, and seem to suffer for months and months and months. Do we know about anything about the long-term effects in a more reliable way?
I can start there. Again, and I'm a pediatrician, so we don't see a lot of disease from COVID, but I think what has been, sort of very shocking in recent days is the reports of a lot of cases of myocarditis in, athletes and young adults who didn't even have a severe infection to begin with. And then all the reports of people who have lingering symptoms for months afterwards that just feel fatigued and have problems getting back to their daily life after this infection. So I think there's more and more evidence that there is a long-term effect, especially cardiovascularly, and maybe with the clotting system, and then that there is some component of a chronic resolution of symptoms, and something that needs to be taken into account, from the physician seeing these patients.
Thanks very much. And perhaps one final question, Anna, it's your turn, is it?
Sure, this one's from Gary Sobel, who asks, should any of the vaccines receive EUA?
Richard.
I'll say not yet. The important criteria for emergency use authorization, or EUA, is that there is a demonstration of safety and efficacy that satisfies FDA's requirements under the circumstances for early release of the vaccine. We are beginning to accumulate, short-term but substantial safety information. The vaccine manufacturers that are doing the phase 3 clinical trials will have scheduled interim analyses that they do, and I don't think any of the trials have reached the point of the interim analyses yet. So really, you couldn't make a case for an emergency use authorization until you've had a look at the data.
Anyone else who would like to come in? No. Well, then let me ask you at the end of our session, not at the beginning, at the end. President Trump obviously seems to believe we will have a vaccine on the 1st of November, just a couple of days before the election. What, in your view, is realistic? When will we have a vaccine which is actually available, not for a few selected people, but for widespread use of people in this country? And secondly, we have now had the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still with us and is still devastating the world. Could there be another pandemic soon afterwards? Even if we do have a vaccine for the current crisis, can we have another scenario with a different virus, perhaps next year or the year after, and would have to go through the same scenario again? Or are we better prepared now? Richard.
Well, let me answer the second question, and then I'll let other colleagues jump in. This is the second pandemic of the 21st century. There were 3 pandemics in the 20th century, and there was a 41-year gap between the last pandemic in 1968 and the 2009 flu pandemic. We know there will be flu pandemics. They occur with some periodicity. It often ranges between 10 and 40 years. We've now had a non-flu pandemic, and as I said in my opening remarks, we have created a society which provides tremendous opportunities for industrious and aspiring microbes. So I think we will continue to see emerging disease outbreaks. They'll continue to be disruptive, expensive, and at some point we are likely to encounter another new respiratory pathogen that spreads around the world within weeks or months.
And you would expect that to happen kind of soon, or not necessarily?
I think it is a paradigmatic threat for the 21st century, and I think it will happen frequently enough. You can't predict them, obviously, but it will happen frequently enough that we need to build systems of defense, just as we have built systems of defense for cybersecurity threats. It's just a part of living in our connected, rapid world that we used to live in and that we hope to get back to.
Thank you. And when can we expect a vaccine for widespread use?
I'm going to stick, I made my first prediction in January of this year, first half of 2021, and I'm going to stick with that. I think in the United States, unlike many other parts of the world, it's possible that might be in the first quarter.
You can't give us a month now?
Nope.
Okay, I'm trying to push you here. Thank you. Deborah, what do you think?
No, I'm not going to make vaccine predictions. I do not claim to be any kind of expert on that. Just a couple of
gut feeling. Our politicians go with a gut feeling. Why not you?
Because I'm not a politician, I guess. But I do have a few thoughts on pandemics. First of all, not all pandemics are respiratory. And I think people forget that HIV/AIDS was a pandemic too. And so the fact that we're going to have emerging zoonotic diseases that travel around the world and put us at enormous risk is indeed a huge part of modern life. It's been a part of world history, but there are more of us, we're closer to more animals, and we're going to have to continue to worry about this forever. And, diseases that have continued to spread around the world in recent years include, Zika and dengue and chikungunya and all these kinds of diseases. So, the reason we had that robust US CDC new and emerging infections program in 45 countries is because these diseases appear all over the place. And Presidents Bush and Obama both thought it was super important and both talked about it. So I think, in terms of the US, in terms of the World Health Organization, a focus on emerging infections of all sorts and with all kinds of vectors is really, really important. In terms of timing, it's like any sort of probabilistic event. There's no guarantee because you have one year that you're not going to have the next one the next year. And part of the reason CDC got so energized in the wake of SARS is because we had H5N1 flu outbreaks in 2004 and 2005, right? So immediately after SARS, they started worrying about pandemic influenza in a very intense way. Those didn't turn out to be the next pandemic, but they were incredibly fatal to the people who got them. So I think we need to be focused on this. We need to not let down our guard, and we need to think broadly, certainly about respiratory disease, but about all kinds of disease that could be the new and emerging infection.
Mm-hmm. And for next year, you would be hopeful that the travel restrictions globally will be removed largely?
One of the things I think is interesting is whether travel is going to decline for a while. So one of the most shocking statistics to me, I heard Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the CNN guy, at a National Academies conference, say that global travel had actually doubled between SARS and COVID. You know, so the numbers were just skyrocketing, and I think people really didn't sort of focus on how much increased travel there was. And I do wonder, in our Zoom worlds where we all have learned a bit, the things that it's actually useful to do without traveling. And that while we all want to get back to some travel, maybe we all don't want as much jet lag as we had before. And, you know, you already have this trend in Europe of climate shaming, right? Apparently there's a word for it in Swedish. I've now forgotten what it is. But you know, that if you get on a plane, your colleagues and your neighbors kind of look down on you. I don't know when climate shaming appears in the US, but I do think, you know, we have young people really pushing new attitudes about climate change. We all have learned to use Zoom better. And frankly, I think it's events like this where travel is unnecessary. I think the big conferences that are all about networking, people are going to want to do them. There are other things where you really have to be there. But all the sort of workshops and meetings and guest speakers and this kind of stuff that we always did by travel, I think we're all going to find that we actually like to do a little bit more Zooming, even if it would be really nice to get back in the classroom and see my students.
Mm-hmm. But what about traveling? Because it's fun, it's pleasant, and because you want to get to know other cultures and be educated. Traveling is supposed to educate yourself, and young people in particular. Do we really want to miss out on that?
I'm saying there may be a different mix. And remember, it wasn't young people doing their big backpack across Asia or around Europe that was driving this doubling. It's a lot of it is global business and constantly flying back and forth. And needing to fly in for a meeting, I think we've all learned how to use technology much, much better. And I'm just hopeful that we might actually all find a new equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The hope.
Yes, let's hope. Thank you. Salli.
Yeah, so the question of will we have more pandemics, I think there's no question we will have more pandemics. I just heard a report today that in Davis, California, they have found Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. Okay, that is the mosquito that carries lots of flaviviruses like dengue, Zika, and that Davis is not on the border with Mexico, right? So anyway, we will have more pandemics. I think we were better prepared for a flu pandemic, I think, than coronavirus for sure. And so we still await that next flu pandemic. And so our public health systems are going to need to improve. Our acceptance of vaccines is going to need to improve. Our vaccine science, I think, will be helped a lot by this experience. And really it's helped a lot by the HIV/AIDS epidemic that really set the groundwork for vaccines at a large scale in scientific effort rather than just a brute force type of effort. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that we will be better prepared, but I'm nervous that we are still going to be rebuilding our public health systems. And as for whether there'll be a vaccine by November, no. And I think that we could see approval, though, near the end of the year, beginning of the year, like Richard said. I've been telling people maybe next summer you'll have a vaccine you can go to the Walgreens to get.
Right, okay. So in the first half of next year, I couldn't really pin you down to a much more precise date, neither of you. You're too cautious, and I would hope that we get it a little earlier, but I think everyone does. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we have had a very insightful, very enlightening panel. Salli Permar, Richard Hatchett, and Deborah Seligsohn, and Tom Bollyky, of course. Thank you very much for joining us today, for sacrificing your time and energy and efforts to be with us tonight. It has been great, and perhaps we can see you again sometime in the not too distant future. For the time being, I would like to thank you again, and I would also like to thank, of course, Anna and Laurel for doing such a good job asking questions. And I would just like to point out that we are meeting again on the 1st of October, which is a Thursday, this time at 5:30 p.m. And it will be an entirely different topic. It will be a comparison between the Roman Empire and the American Empire. And we will ask the question that the three experts, including UNC's Richard Talbot, will ask the question, why did the Roman Empire last so long and why did it collapse eventually? And of course, some people may wonder if there is some reference to the so-called American Empire, but we will find out in 1 week time already on Thursday, October the 1st, 5:30 p.m. Until then, let me thank you again, and thanks for our viewers for sticking with us. There are quite a significant number of viewers still here, and I'm very impressed by their persistence and patience. And let me thank you again, everyone, for being with us tonight. Thanks a lot. It was really good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very fun.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.